All right, part 3 of lecture. We left off talking about the Game Boy and the idea of having a handheld gaming system at your disposal. Um, Sega, of course, being Nintendo's main competitor at this point, also puts forth a new gaming system. It is the Sega Genesis. We're not going to talk a ton about the Sega Genesis because I want to reserve most of part 3 for talking about music of Zelda and of Final Fantasy, of which I have a lot to say. So let's get there. Talking a little bit about bridging the gap between 1989 and into the 90s. Like I said, Sega releases the Sega Genesis, and then later in 1992, the Sega CD is released. And again, we had been going back and forth between the idea of media on cartridges and also on disc. And both have, well, definitely cartridges have interesting limitations to them, but were used up until the Nintendo 64 as far as obviously Nintendo was concerned. 1994, probably one of the biggest Final Fantasies comes out, and that's Final Fantasy VI. It is hugely popular. Some say it is the most popular of all the Final Fantasies. I'm going to go ahead and say it's Final Fantasy VII. Why? Because they've decided to remake it and spend a lot of effort in doing so. But 1994 is the year for Final Fantasy VI. And in the following year, 1995 and 1996, we have two gaming systems that are now at odds with one another. It is going to be the Sony releases the PlayStation, again, disc-oriented media, and Nintendo releases the Nintendo 64. And both of them have some interesting exclusivity packages when it comes to characters and storylines and essentially games. So Final Fantasy ends up being picked up by Sony and is released on the PlayStation console, and classics like Mario and Zelda continue to be perpetuated on Nintendo's platform. So I was lucky enough to have a Nintendo 60, well, we had both a Nintendo 64 and a PlayStation. I had the PlayStation, my sister had an N64. And so between the both of us, we had our games certainly covered. I have a huge love for the Final Fantasy series because it happens to use some very interesting leitmotifs and character developments alongside with the underscoring. We'll talk about Final Fantasy VII shortly, but the first thing I want to talk about is Zelda and Zelda's music. Particularly, and I know you guys know that I have a penchant for the macabre, the mysterious, the dark, and perhaps the dreary. One of the sort of claims to fame of the sound design for the composer who wrote Zelda's Ocarina of Time uses a lot of like creepy musical cues. And I want to talk a little bit about how you can create that in the context of video games, which I think is so important because there's usually some sort of like conflict and resolution that's required. And, you know, we talked a lot about atonality and music of the 20th century. There's a lot of atonal or dissonant techniques that are used within video game scores that are very kind of art music like. So 8-Bit came out with a video talking a little bit about some of the creepy music that is used in Zelda. So let me toggle over to my video. So Koji Kondo is the composer that is credited for the music of Zelda as it was released for N64, both Majora's Mask and Ocarina of Time. Let's check out some of his, we're not going to watch all 12 minutes of this video, although I really encourage you to check out how sort of techniques that were used in 20th century art music are also used in video game scoring.
Of the music of Koji Kondo, there are a few different characteristics that immediately spring to mind. Bright, cheery grooves, big, heroic chord progressions, and some of the most iconic, unforgettable melodies ever written. With such an impressive selection of main themes under his belt, it's easy to brush over the fact that Kondo is also responsible for some of the most ominous and unsettling music in video game history, with tunes that manage to creep you out while still being just as memorable and evocative as his more popular and optimistic compositions. So how does Koji Kondo unsettle you? First, we have to figure out what it means for something to feel creepy in general. Obviously, it's related to being scared, or just feeling uneasy. But if I had to take a stab at more accurately defining the feeling, I'd say it has to do with an implied sense of danger combined with an uncertainty or ambiguity about the situation you're in. It's much creepier to eat dinner with someone who you think might pose an unspecified threat to you than it is to, say, enter a heroic battle of life and death with an evil villain, even if the latter is technically way more dangerous. It's also related to things feeling unnatural or out of place, like the uncanny valley phenomenon. That is, the closer a fake human face is to looking like a real human face, the creepier it gets, until, of course, it crosses that threshold where it becomes truly convincing. I think that Koji Kondo taps into these two aspects of creepiness in his music, especially in the early Zelda games. Let's take a look. One of the easiest ways to latch on to a piece of music is through rhythm. Rhythm and dancing are an innate part of being a human, and so a consistent beat can make us feel good and put us at ease. Going even further with this idea, we also find comfort in the consistency of the larger musical form of a piece. It all comes down to consistency and meeting the expectations of the listener. Music that makes use of a lot of repetition and consistent lengths of phrases is very easy to listen to because it matches the listener's expectations. This is the reason why 90% of music is written in 4 and 8 bar phrases. We've come to expect it over time, and we love consistency.
The other thing is, like, we've also looked a lot at repetitive structures that have happened in early video game music. The Mario's theme, Tetris, all of these things involve high amounts of repetition, loops that all involve a lot of rhythmic consistency for that reason.
When the harmony part comes into the Forest Temple theme from Ocarina of Time, with these spacey synth pads playing or repeating E major to F with a flattened fifth, we don't get this kind of top-level consistency. The main harmonic idea is stated in 5-bar phrases, and the phrases are never played quite the same way twice.
In that small example, there's this feeling of manufactured, like, rubato, this feeling of like washiness of time, and the triplet, which is obviously incomplete here, feels just sort of like a rhythmic scattering. Makes the feel like a combination of atmospheric, but also like doesn't have that kind of same repetitive ostinato vibe as some of the other pieces do that are included in Zelda.
Kondo deliberately avoids any exact repetitions of this phrase to keep the listener from being able to reliably expect what's coming next. This ambiguity is unsettling on an almost unconscious level. Oftentimes in dungeon music, Kondo will abandon any sort of typical harmonic progression and focus entirely on creating uncomfortable voicings. For example, take the inside of Jabu-Jabu's belly theme, which moves this cluster chord voicing up and down in whole and half steps. Using cluster chord voicings is another great way to create unease, as they usually don't imply any sort of definite harmony on their own, which keeps the listener on their toes. These types of
these are techniques that were really common for composers in the 20th century. These, what we call clusters, these combinations of sounds that really are not what we call functioning. And non-functional harmony, as we've already discovered, makes us feel rather unsettled about something, which is exactly how we're supposed to feel about the situation we're in. We're inside of a large whale fish thing's belly.
The voicings also allow Kondo to focus on using only dissonant intervals like seconds and tritones. Not only are these chords pretty ambiguous in quality, they also don't fit into any one clear scale or key. This keeps us as listeners from being able to rest anywhere. There are no points of resolution ever, so we're always just feeling that vague dissonance that keeps us on edge. Another place we see cluster chords is all over Majora's Mask's Snowhead Temple theme. Besides the sound of the howling wind and some creepy industrial noises, this tune is almost entirely made up of this staccato major second interval fading away underneath these rhythmic cluster chord stabs, once again featuring Kondo's favorite tritone filled in with a whole step. Notice how the rhythmic displacement between these two groups of stabs just toys with our expectations a little bit, making us feel just a little off. So, we have a couple musical techniques for creating harmonic and rhythmic ambiguity to keep our listeners on edge, unable to anticipate exactly what's coming next. Now let's move on to something a little more unnatural. Kondo loves to use the interval of a perfect fourth in his creepier music. The perfect fourth is a weird interval for sure. It doesn't sound harsh or dissonant like a minor second or a major seventh does, but it doesn't sound nice on its own like a third or a sixth. By itself.
So we won't talk much more about like the intervallic content here. Essentially what a lot of the remainder of the video uses is like the idea of these unsettling scenes not playing into the idea of functional harmony, and that's pretty important. The other thing that I want to kind of draw attention to is this idea of rhythmic inconsistency, because I think that's a much more salient feature right off the bat. In the very final battle between Link and Ganon, we have a very radical musical cue that is meant to really keep you on your toes and make you feel very uncomfortable. I want to play a little bit of that and show you what the notation looks like for it as well. All right, here's the boss battle with Ganon.
Course about the infamous Ganondorf Battle theme from Ocarina of Time. This tune's really got it all. A constant barrage of 16th notes, chromatically shifting harmony, a melody that deliberately clashes with the harmony, and, to top it all off, a time signature of 23/16. When you break it down here, what we see outlined by the xylophone, timpani, and snare drum is a pattern of 3 groups of 3/16th notes, followed by a group of 4/16th notes. This makes one bar of 13/16, which is already pretty out there. We then see our metrical life hack from earlier used here, with every other bar knocking out one of these groups of 3/16 to make a bar of 10/16 or 5/8. Alternating consistently between these two rhythmic groupings adds up to a bar of 23/16, and it sounds like this. It's pretty wild, and without having the music in front of you, it's really hard to follow, which makes it perfect for this boss fight.
Great, and indeed, it is quite a fight at the very end of Ocarina of Time. So use of both dissonant harmonies there and a constantly shifting asymmetrical or mixed meter, which makes it feels very, very irregular and hard to follow. So a lot of the techniques that we've listened to are making appearances, certainly within the context of music for cinema and music for video games. There is a lot of really interesting footage of music in Final Fantasy, specifically Final Fantasy VII. And like I've said, Final Fantasy VII was initially released for the original PlayStation and has been undergoing a remake over the last few decades, or a couple of decades at least. And the film score, it really does feel like a film score. The video game score has also received a huge revamp, and it's very exciting to listen to, mostly because there was a huge difference in terms of the sound qualities that were possible with the PlayStation. Again, we're dealing with something that's aligned with 64 64-bit sound, the same kind of sound profile that we're listening to in Zelda for the Ocarina of Time, which is since received an orchestral reconsideration. And the difference between the two is quite remarkable. So we're going to watch a couple of minutes of a side-by-side comparison of the original Final Fantasy VII introduction, well, sort of the Make a Reactor music that's part of the initial scene that opens up both games, and how it differs from the original in the PlayStation and the one that's just been released for PlayStation 3. All right, hold on for just a moment. So I've skipped a little bit of the introduction here, but I think the whole video is fascinating. We won't watch all 16 minutes of it, but I want to get to at least the comparison of the original versus the remake. And you'll be able to see what the graphics were like, obviously, on the original PlayStation, very polygonal, lacking a whole lot of depth. But even so, there was such an interest in the characters and the storyline here, and it was so compelling and so original that it's been remade and made anew, honestly. So enjoy some of this footage. I will supplement it with some of my own commentary.
With the soundtrack, too, while Uematsu's melodies are kept in pristine condition, the composers weren't afraid to make big changes to the arrangement of each track to bring out different qualities of the original compositions. This has resulted in a little bit of controversy, unsurprisingly, with the Macro Reactor theme specifically garnering criticism for sounding too orchestral in comparison to the original music's synth-driven, futuristic sound. As someone who has never played the original Final Fantasy VII, I thought my unbiased and nostalgia-free ears would be in a perfect position to judge whether the remade Macro Reactor theme truly holds up to the original Uematsu classic. First, let's look at the original theme. We start off with a solemn rhythmic statement on a low C made by timpani and low piano, with various mechanical sighs and whirring helping to set the tone for sneaking around an industrial facility.
Those are octaves, very open and hollow intervals, kind of creepy sounding.
As the creepy melody comes in with a biting synth, the timpani switches to a quarter note pulse with the low piano bass line maintaining its initial rhythmic motif. Using a low bass pedal on the root note for a whole section like this sounds super ominous, especially in conjunction with the melody, which switches between evoking a natural C minor sound via the flat 6th and flat 7th, and outlining a B flat minor triad over the C bass pedal for some somber dissonance.
Important to note that like the echo here kind of creates like a disembodied feel and makes it kind of feel like it's a bending of reality and fiction, and that's something that like Cloud, one of the main characters, or the main character here, is sort of dealing with, is these like kind of flashbacks that occur, and this is like a way of maybe musically identifying that that's going to be something that plays an important role, at least subconsciously, perhaps sonically.
We have here a very dark sound. The rhythm, tempo, and bass pedal all suggest a funeral march kind of vibe to me, with the jagged synth melody suggesting a more futuristic sound. Combined, you could say that these elements evoke the sound of a dystopian future, which couldn't be more perfect considering the setting. Moving along, we see an interesting combination of more typical orchestral instruments and synth sounds. Pulsing string chords alternate between C minor and B flat minor triads over the same bass pedal figure as before we modulate suddenly to the key of G minor, where we're joined by a metallic chime synth melody and offbeat synth stabs outlining the G minor harmony.
Let's pause this real quick. So C and G are the two kind of main areas that we've been focusing on. C1, G5, 1 and 5. These are still reiterating tonal and functional aspects of harmony. So although we have a lot of dissonance here, we are still like functioning. There's this kind of feeling of being at odds because we have this feeling of function versus dysfunction that's all wrapped up into one sort of musical line, which is very interesting.
After this, we again modulate suddenly, this time to the key of B flat minor, where the same arrangement plays out until we repeat back to the C minor melody at the top of the form. Everything about this piece is cold, dark, industrial, and ominous. The remake's version of the Mako Reactor theme sounds to me to be even darker and more ominous, although it does somewhat lose the dystopian industrial tinge. The tempo is slower, and while that iconic rhythmic motif is still played by the timpani in the tune's intro, once the melody comes in, that's replaced with a simplified half-note based rhythm. The slower tempo and the loss of the driving quarter-note timpani part mean that this arrangement feels a lot more subdued than the original, but to be honest, I think this adds to the sense of foreboding. The synth that brought in that first jagged melody is replaced with low strings and octaves, which are just gorgeous. They bring this haunting and tragic quality that the original tune just didn't have. Just like the original, we have a 4-bar transition with the strings giving us a stabbing C minor to B flat minor over C progression, while the timpani resumes the original rhythmic motif. When the shift to G minor hits though, the floor drops out from underneath us. No offbeat synth arpeggio, no driving timpani, just high string pads and a piano melody over a low bass drone. This drastic departure from the original arrangement has much less rhythmic drive, but it's for two good reasons. First, this gives the arrangement room to grow. As the section progresses towards the end, new elements are gradually added back in. So
the rest of this video, super interesting, very detailed analysis of how there are musical differences and what that kind of means to gameplay for those who are used to the original version that was released for PlayStation and the remake. The remake has a full orchestral palette, and it is so much more cinematic than the PlayStation version. And what was interesting though is that, like, for the gaming consoles that were released 1995, 1996, those consoles that were released still used a lot of like kind of cinematic approaches, but just didn't have the orchestral palette for them. And we saw that as early as like you know, the inclusion of the Laserdisc and the release of Dragon Slayer, right? So the interest was there, but just like the means in which to produce it wasn't quite. Before I cut this segment and leave the last segment to talk about the Untitled Goose Game and some other current trends that are happening in video games, I wanted to take a look at Breath of the Wild. Nintendo Switch, again, Nintendo is continuing to perpetuate their platform. It's such an interesting marriage of a handheld device and also a home device, much like the laptop is for us, I think, now. Some of us very much use it, well, again, current situations as an at-home device, but it is very mobile as well. Musical cues here are just as elevated and sophisticated as they are in the Final Fantasy original, or even in the remake. Breath of the Wild, very cool Zelda game, has some very interesting features that are not a part of the Zelda games that precede it. But one of the things that it does have is some very interesting scoring, the idea of creating atmospheres, and atmospheres that aren't necessarily just rhythmically repetitive ostinatos. To give you some idea of the soundscape that is used and some of the sound design in Breath of the Wild, let's turn our attention over to just a little bit of one more 8-bit video. All right, here's a little bit of Breath of the Wild. Again, this maker has gone to the trouble of doing a 4-part musical analysis because there's so many interesting musical cues here. I just want to play some of the cues that happen, and how orchestration is, which is one of the big things that wasn't really possible. Like using a diverse number of colors wasn't possible in earlier orchestras in the Baroque era and the classical era, for example. Early games just didn't have the diversity of a sound palette that they did with the Nintendo Switch or later PlayStation consoles.
It's a game that's not afraid to cast away parts of its series' tradition, and in doing so, it has preserved the core of what makes Zelda great better than most other games in the series. Whether or not you think it deserves the praise it's been getting, you can't deny that Breath of the Wild is a landmark title in the Zelda franchise. For better or worse, the series will now forever be divided into before Breath of the Wild and after Breath of the Wild. In this video, I'm going to talk about the music of Breath of the Wild and how it perfectly reflects the game's bold new direction for the series, as well as its obvious respect for its legacy. First things first, what's new about this soundtrack? Well, as it turns out, quite a lot. In my first ever YouTube video, I looked at the overworld themes of each console Zelda game up until that point, and talked about what made them sound like Zelda music, and how the changes in each theme reflected the personality of the game it belonged to. Let's continue that trend by looking at Breath of the Wild's Hyrule Field theme.
I love this. Little bird sounds almost. That's what like grace note is, that like really tiny note. There we go. Before we go on, sparse piano writing. It's not particularly, it's not tonal. It's not, I mean, it's not atonal. It's hard to pick out what our note is that we're really supposed to be trying to be paying attention to. Just looking at the page, there's a lot of B flats. But if we were in a major key, it would be in the key of E flat. So E, F, G, A, B, like we're sort of making a little bit of a mess of trying to navigate what key we're listening to. As a result, it kind of feels like a little bit new, a little bit hopeful, a little bit like it's trying to grow its own legs. It's like a little new spring chicken. And it doesn't quite have rhythmic consistency yet. And it's somewhat irregular, lots of rubato, but not in like an eerie kind of way, in a sort of like hopeful way. We have lots of empty intervals, and using a range of the piano that's especially with the pedal down, resonant and vast sounding. And I think that's probably one of the most important details, is that it sounds as big as the world is in Zelda when you're looking at Hyrule.
This theme has been controversial to say the least, with people accusing it of sounding like random notes on a piano, someone just played piano for the first time, and god-awful. And no, it is not an exciting, bombastic, or even particularly adventurous piece of music. But what it lacks in energy, it makes up for in mood, and the subtlety and craft on display are nothing short of impressive. While it may seem like random notes at first, the song actually takes us through a complete musical journey, leading me to believe that the composition process was very deliberate. The first 2 notes immediately put us in the key of E flat.
So we're going to go through a more concentrated musical analysis, which is where I will stop our share. But there are 3 other parts to talking about just the music that's being used in Breath of the Wild, which I think is really, really, really well crafted and does a lot in terms of creating a convincing atmosphere for gameplay. Part 4, and I can't believe we're already at part 4. I'm going to talk about current trends that are happening. Again, I would have loved to have done an entire lecture just on Zelda, an entire lecture just on Final Fantasy VII. So I hope you guys don't feel slighted in sort of the narrow range of what I was able to cover. But in our 4th and final part, I want to talk about current trends that are happening. I'm not going to be exhaustive, but I want to talk about the Untitled Goose Game first and foremost, because it uses a interesting collage method of a score using pieces by Claude Debussy, a piece of, or a composer who wrote during a lot of important piano pieces and other instrumental pieces in the Romantic era, an impressionist kind of composer. Very good. I will see you guys for our final segment shortly.